Hey everyone, welcome back to our third and final season of His Dark Materials. I want to start off by apologizing for the tardiness of these videos. When the show premiered in the US, I was actually finishing my graduate degree, time was a little dicey, and also HBO released the show 2 episodes at a time, so I wasn't really sure how I was going to release these videos outside of the normal 1 episode per week schedule. To be honest, I was also pretty bummed that the show was ending. I realized I had been avoiding working on this because I wasn't ready to accept that it would mean saying goodbye to Lyra and the gang, but here we are. I absolutely loved this season. I have very few negative things to say about it, so I am excited to get into the nitty-gritty and want to thank you for being along for the ride with me. The episode starts with some more meta narration by Zephania, who is the leader of the Rebel Angels that we kind of met last season. She tells us the history of the so-called creator god and tells us that he is by no means the creator. He's just one of the oldest, if not the oldest angel who was there before the others and took that opportunity to tell the others that he created them. He is extremely old at this point, so old that he doesn't actually rule the kingdom of heaven anymore, and he is assisted by a regent angel, and we come to find out that regent angel is called Metatron. He used to be a human named Enoch, who was 6 generations away from Adam. She tells us that the serpent has been summoned, there is a new Eve on the scene, and that the rebellion has officially begun. Will spends his time in this episode looking between the worlds for Lyra. He has her backpack, and at some point he actually tries to use the alethiometer to track her down. He's unsuccessful, but we can tell that he is in fierce and kind of desperate pursuit for her. He has not abandoned her and seems quite upset that she is nowhere to be seen. With that said, Will is not alone. He is actually being followed by the best 2 gay angels around, Baruch and Balthamos. They understand that he is the bearer of Asahetra, the creator-destroying knife, and they want to bring him to Azrael's camp, recruit him for the war, and hopefully use Asahetra against the authority. I was so delighted that Baruch and Balthamos were given such a large part in this season of His Dark Materials. They were 2 of my favorite characters in the book, and to be honest, I think they were probably the first extremely positive representation of gay male love that I came across in my literary journey as a teenager. They made such a big impression on me, and I just so appreciate the respect and compassion and humanity that Philip Pullman used to write them. They have such a devotion to each other and such a pure sweetness, and I really loved seeing that not only as a teenager but represented on TV for all of us to witness and be inspired by, to be honest. Will has his own agenda. He is not ready to take his knife to Azrael just yet, and due to his own stubbornness, but also the intensity of his desire to find Lyra, he convinces Baruch and Balthamos that he will help them only after they help him track Lyra down. As angels, they have a special ability to locate people, and that is what they will do. Our first glimpse of Lyra is actually in what looks like a very desolate wasteland. She's hearing Roger call for her, and at the same time we also hear kind of a monkey grunting in the background. We realize that she is in a very remote looking building, and she is indeed with Mrs. Coulter and the golden monkey. In the book, she's actually in the Himalayas. I'm not sure exactly why they switched up the location, but we come to find out that she's on the island of Fair Isle in, I think they call it the German Sea in Philip Pullman's world. It's in this first episode that we meet Amma, who is a child who lives on Fair Isle and has been helping Mrs. Coulter with supplies. We see her come back to where Mrs. Coulter is hiding out. I'll refer to it as the chapel, since I believe that's what they call it on the show. She confronts Mrs. Coulter with some of the gossip that she's heard that Mrs. Coulter might not be alone with her demon in the chapel. Mrs. Coulter agrees that yes, she does have a secret. Her daughter is with her as well. And she tells Amma that an enchanter has put a spell on her daughter, causing her daughter to fall into this unending sleep. She is trying to break the spell, but she needs time to do so. And she asks that Amma not share this with anyone since it's a matter of security. Amma seems assuaged by this. She agrees to keep this secret between the two of them and do whatever she can to help. At some point, she also hugs Mrs. Coulter, and there's kind of this interesting contrast of Mrs. Coulter, again, luring a child into her web of lies, whereas her own child is just yards away asleep because of Mrs. Coulter. And sure enough, when Amma leaves, we hear Pan pleading with Mrs. Coulter to let them go, and Mrs. Coulter is certainly not going to do that. She feeds Lyra a decoction, as Philip Pullman calls it in the book, that puts Lyra back into a very deep sleep. It's clear Mrs. Coulter is the enchantress that she told Amma about. And speaking of Lyra's no good, horrible parents, Asriel is up to no good on his own somewhere else. He is in a very interesting helicopter type device called the Intention Craft. He's doing some kind of military operation, it looks like, and not long after we first see him, the Intention Craft crashes, he parachutes down, he's safe, and it turns out that he is on his way to execute some kind of jailbreak. He has 3 very tiny people with him. We come to learn that they're called Gallivespians, though I'm not sure they ever name them as such in the show. But he has come to help free a military commander named Commander Ogunwe, who is being held by the authority in Ogunwe's world. They're called the Temple, and Asriel has come to recruit. I thought this was actually a very clever mechanism in the show. The show pointed to these really interesting parallels that I think were much more subtle in the book. We see Asriel performing this jailbreak of Ogunwe in this first episode, and later on in the season, spoiler alert, Lyra does something but on a much, much bigger scale. We also know from the last season, and actually the first season, that Mrs. Coulter has this special and kind of very loose connection with her demon that is much more like that of a witch. She's able to separate from the golden monkey, and spoiler again, that is something that Lyra herself does later this season as well. So interesting repeating patterns. Apple doesn't fall far from the tree. In some ways, Lyra is completely different from her parents. But I wanted to point this out because I thought it was very clever writing on the part of the show. I do have to note that one of the small disappointments I had about this season was regarding the Gallivespians. In the book, we learn so much more about them, about the world they come from, and in the book, they don't have wings. They ride around on these gigantic dragonflies that are described as having the size of a seagull. They play a really important part in the story in a way that I don't think they do in the show, and I'm guessing it was due to either budgetary limitations or the complexity of having an additional thing flying around. Had to note that, saw it, didn't love it, but understand it, and it wasn't too impactful for me. In Lyra's world, Father MacPhail, who has just been catapulted to power in the Magisterium, heads to the Magisterium headquarters in Geneva. He there restyles himself as Father President, no longer called Father MacPhail, and really seems to relish the attention and respect that he can now garner from the church. The show doesn't get into it at all, but there is some backstory in the book about why the Magisterium is headquartered in Geneva. Philip Pullman has this whole alternate history timeline where instead of the rise of Roman Catholicism and the Pope in Rome, the church goes a different way and ends up following John Calvin in Geneva. Calvinism, Protestantism. Interesting backstory, not at all covered in the show, but I noticed it and I appreciated that they kept this detail. We find out that the Magisterium has been busy cracking down on people in its world, primarily that poetry has now been banned and that people who read poetry are being arrested. We also get to meet super haughty, sadistic Father Gomez, who is one of the lower ranking fathers in the magisterium, very, very eager to please. One of Father Gomez's primary attributes is that he is really into physical punishment and physical atonement. So there's that. Ogunwe agrees to hear Azriel out to at least a certain extent. He takes Azriel back to his own camp where we see him reunite with his daughters. It's a very sweet moment and a very stark contrast to Azriel, who doesn't really give a fuck about his own daughter at this point. I think that was very intentional on the part of the show to see Ogunwe as this very strong leader who also has such a closeness to his family. We find out that in Ogunwe's world, the temple, as they're called, has been severing children from their demon, and his daughter is one of the girls that has been affected. It seems to be primarily about controlling girls, which we hear about a little later on. Azriel gives Ogunwe the elevator pitch for his rebellion, and fortunately, it is interrupted by a drone strike from the temple. Father McPhail confides in Father Gomez about the prophecy about Lyra and asks Father Gomez if he would potentially lead the charge against Lyra once she's been located. Father Gomez is only too happy to agree to this. He takes it upon himself to visit Fra Pavel, who is the magisterium's alethiometrist, because Fra Pavel tends to be pretty slow with his reading. He applies an interesting combination of false sympathy and charm, and pressure and vague threats of violence to Fra Pavel to speed up that process. Angel Baruch is able to use Lyra's alethiometer to locate her successfully, which is great news for Will because it means he can reunite with her. And after some back and forth, the angels decide to split up. It's agreed that Balthamos will take Will to rescue Lyra, and Baruch will travel to Azriel's headquarters to tell him that he has the knife, they're on their way, and to update him on the situation. I found this scene between Baruch and Balthamos as they part from each other to be such a sweet portrayal of devotion and gay love. I think it is very unique in the purity that it has and the respect that it shows these two characters. It's also one of the few relationships in his Dark Materials of two adults treating each other with kindness, no matter their gender, their sex, their sexuality, what kind of creature they are. This is probably the only time we see two adults who absolutely love and respect one another expressing those things in front of kids. So we could almost see it as a model for Will of how love can look in adult life. I think that is really important for kids, not just for kids who may be gay and haven't come out yet or who don't have representation in their everyday life. I think it's really wonderful for all children to see a depiction of love that is so strong and so devoted. Perhaps we don't see any of the flaws or complexity of it, but I think it is truly lovely. Back on Fair Isle, Pan actually wakes Lyra up while Mrs. Coulter is sleeping and nudges her to leave. He says that this is a potential for them to actually escape Mrs. Coulter. And we see the two of them stagger out of the chapel while the golden monkey, very much awake, is kind of passively watching all of this. He watches them leave before sounding the alarm, which I thought was curious, and then we see Lyra hiding with Pan very groggily while Mrs. Coulter is calling for her. It doesn't take long for Mrs. Coulter to succeed in that, and she sits next to Lyra, who is confused and scared at the sight of her mother, and Mrs. Coulter tries to explain why she's doing what she's doing. She's doing this for Lyra. She needs to keep Lyra safe. This is the only way to go about it, and she only has the best intentions. She says this as she reaches for a handkerchief and proceeds to chloroform Lyra in front of the golden monkey, Pan, and, unbeknownst to her, Amma, who is hiding and watching the whole thing. Amma is horrified by this, realizing that she has been duped by Mrs. Coulter, and again, Mrs. Coulter is in fact the enchanter who has been keeping Lyra asleep all this time. On his journey to find Lyra in Fair Isle, Will actually stumbles across Uric Burnison, who is in the middle of having a fight with townspeople. This was another wonderful parallel to what happened earlier in the show with Lyra herself. Will immediately recognizes Yurik Bernison for the Yurik of Lyra's stories. He also sees an opportunity to prevent many townspeople from being hurt, and he decides to intervene. Yurik is upset because the townspeople have captured a she-bear, and he is struggling to free her, whereas of course the townspeople are probably using the she-bear for nefarious purposes. We don't really know. Anyway, Will challenges Yurik to single combat, and the two have a very interesting dynamic. Yurik says it would be shameful to fight Will since he is an oyster without a shell, very, very weak against Yurik's strength and the sharpness of his claws. Will says that they can even the playing field if Yurik gives him a piece of his armor. Yurik agrees to this, drops his helmet, and Will takes out his knife, slicing through Yurik's helmet in a matter of seconds. Yurik recognizes that he cannot possibly defeat this knife. This knife is much, much more powerful than he is, and he cedes victory to Will in this not even started single combat. This diffuses the situation successfully. Will asks that the she-bear be freed, which she is, and he very easily earns the respect of Yurik and also his companionship. Yurik agrees to help Will free Lyra, and the two of them head off with Balthamos onto the boat to Fair Isle. With a very generous nudge from Father Gomez, Fra Pavel has been able to locate Lyra through his own alethiometer. This sets the Magisterium's wheels in motion, and Father President has asked Gomez to go bring back Mrs. Coulter and Lyra dead or alive. Father Gomez is stoked about this. He says that he has done preemptive penance his entire adult life and is absolutely ready for the challenge and the honor. The idea of preemptive penance is absolutely hilarious to me. Philip Pullman wrote this in the book, and I was struck by the richness, the irony, and the absurdity of it. I feel like this is one of Philip Pullman's shadier and subtler attacks on the church. So that is where we stand at the end of episode 1. This episode is really, again, about telling us what all the characters are up to, putting all the pieces in place, and getting us ready for a lot of action that is about to start happening pretty immediately. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm so glad to be back. I hope you had a wonderful holiday season with friends and family. I hope you're all in good health, and please join me for the rest of this season. My cat is just like up to no good.